Hello everybody, welcome to Awesome Rusty Buckets. If you're ever on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and drop a like on this video. It helps it do better in the algorithm, so it's much appreciated. And if you want to check this out as an audio-only experience, look at us over on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Those links will be in the description. Also linked in the description will be our Patreon, which you can go ahead and subscribe to for $3 a month if you want to join our private Discord server, get a bunch of extra content behind the scenes. Anybody who donates, that's super duper appreciated. But with that said, let's go ahead and get into today's video that was supposed to come out a couple weeks ago. I released my most overrated video, overrated player on each team video, which I kind of hate doing that video, but it kind of feels necessary as another side of the coin to what this video is. And unfortunately, the overrated videos do better than the underrated videos, but I didn't end up making this one. It just fell through the cracks. I've had the list ready to go for forever. So with that said, let's get into the most underrated player on every NBA team, at least according to me, which I do want to mention, this is all my opinion based on my experience, and underrated and overrated is entirely determined by your perspective. I have been in NBA discourse very prominently for nearly a decade now, so this is what is coming across my desk, not necessarily what comes across yours as a fan. But with that said, let's get into this shit. First things first, with the Atlanta Hawks, I am going to go with Bogdan Bogdanovic. The way that Bogey ended up tearing it up in the Olympics, there were a lot of moments where he was just absolutely electric. Didn't really surprise me all that much. First of all, obviously, we see stuff like that happen all the time with foreign players where you're like, oh, so this guy's just Michael Jordan in the Olympics? Cool. I honestly think that he's someone who has never really had opportunity that is all that fair given his capabilities, like playing alongside Trae Young, and in the past 2 years, Trae Young and DeJounte Murray. His value as a creating guard has inherently been a little bit limited, but the guy is an excellent three-point shooter, a good playmaker, good at scoring inside the three-point line as well. I don't think he's like some phenomenal mid-range scorer or paint threat, but he's definitely not bad in those areas, and he's definitely a good defensive player. But I honestly feel like if you put him in the right situation, he could be a 20-point scorer and not just like an empty calories 20-point scorer type of situation. Moving on next to the Boston Celtics, my answer is still Kristaps Porzingis, and I think that's just because of him getting injured in the playoffs this last year, which isn't necessarily all that shocking. He didn't get a lot of time to shine, and thus his praise became more minimal, especially by contrast to someone like Jaylen Brown, who I don't think is like astronomically better than Porzingis, as though the discourse would probably have you feel. Yeah, I mean, his impact on both ends of the floor, his ability to space from outside while also still being a really good role threat, the fact that he is a really good rim protector, but also not a slow-footed big man by any means. He really just fits exactly. He is that Swiss Army knife on a team of Swiss Army knives that just makes them, I don't know, a fuckload of Swiss Army knives, I guess. Moving on to the Miami Heat. Speaking of Swiss Army knives, I gotta pick Bam Adebayo. If I had to pick somebody else besides for him, I would maybe go with Nikola Jovic, but I want to do these kind of relative, and I feel like Bam has always been a super underrated player. Now, that said, recently, there has been a lot of hype for him going into this season, to a degree that I'm almost concerned about, because it is setting a level of expectation that he might not necessarily meet, because we've had a couple of different times now where we're like, okay, Bam's gonna start taking threes, Bam's gonna start being a more prolific scoring option, and then he just doesn't end up doing that. I feel like that's happened like 2 seasons at least out of his career at this point. But there's a lot of hype for him going into this year, a lot of that based on how he performed in the Olympics. He's been taking a lot of three-pointers in the preseason, so it looks like maybe we will be seeing a leap from Bam Adebayo. And I honestly think if you utilized him more properly and viewed him as more of a focal point, unlike how the Miami Heat have, who have a more egalitarian approach, and when they do default to one individual, it's always Jimmy Butler. I think that he could be like a B plus, dare I even say like an A minus version of Kevin Garnett, which is a very, very good borderline superstar player. He is already one of the best defenders, if not the best defender in the NBA, and his offensive game is one that I have always thought had more potential than he ended up displaying. Maybe there's a cap on it that I'm not giving enough credit to, but I do actually buy a lot of the hype for Bam going into this year. He's actually one of my favorite players in the NBA at this point, just because his archetype of player is one that's pretty hard to find. On the Chicago Bulls, you would already know this if you've been on this channel enough. Ayo Dosunmu is someone who I just cannot stop giving praise to. He had about as good of a role player season as one can have, especially in the context of being on the Chicago Bulls, this perpetually mid-NBA team, but he is an amazing defensive player. And then on the offensive end, he kind of has some untapped playmaking potential just because his ball handling is not always the best, but he has improved in that area and he utilized his passing more. I believe he averaged 4 or 5 assists last season. This is the take that I always have about him. I don't think the gap between him and Kobe White is that dramatic. Kobe White is a better one-on-one scorer, but I think Ayo is a better all-around player, better role player for sure, better in a more reduced role for sure. And I think Ayo Dosunmu is, I've compared him to Drew Holiday. I'm specifically thinking like Boston Celtics Drew Holiday. Like, I don't think he's gonna be a 20-8 all defense guy, maybe an all defense guy, but not also while putting up like all-star level offensive numbers, but like an extremely efficient 15, really, really good lights out 3-point shooting, and then some of the best perimeter defense from any guard in the NBA. I think Ayo Dosunmu can be at that level probably pretty soon. He's already not that far from it. For the Charlotte Hornets, I have to go with Mark Williams, and this is the case of just like, dude's a Hornet, so not a lot of people really know him all that well. If you're a Hornets fan, you know well about Mark Williams, but he's a double-double 5, strong finisher, good offensive rebounder, and a solid rim protector. He is the best center that Charlotte has had since Al Jefferson, which I recognize is not saying a lot, because like, who's next best up on that list? Like Dwight Howard and Cody Zeller. But Mark is good as fuck, and I feel like a lot of people look at, and understandably so, the Hornets as like this LaMelo and Brandon Miller duo, but Mark Williams to me is very much a key part of the future of that team just as well. Not as much, but he's a big part of it, and I don't think a lot of people outside of Charlotte are all too aware of just how good he is. I think it's interesting that like Jalen Duren gets as much as attention and credit as he ends up doing, while they're basically a very similar player in terms of box score. And if anything, I think Mark Williams is probably a better defensive player. For the Washington Wizards, I gotta go with Corey Kispert. There's pretty slim pickings on this team, but Corey is easily the guy who on this team screams good role player that's just being wasted on a bad team. I would not be surprised if he ended up being a sizable and important contributor on a contender after the trade deadline. I would only hope for him, but he's a movement shooter, good enough at attacking off of the catch, decent enough decision maker, and he's not like a bad defensive player, not really a good one either, but in terms of like an offensive option you can have while not necessarily looking to feed them the ball that much, a movement shooter like Corey Kispert fits with just about any damn NBA team. On to the Detroit Pistons, I am going to go with Jaden Ivey, who has been looking fucking great in the preseason thus far. Like nothing but super efficient scoring outings, hitting his 3-pointers, being really aggressive as soon as Cade is no longer on the floor. He definitely had his fair share of inconsistency in his rookie year. There is no denying that. But what exactly about the Detroit Pistons is consistent? Like, that expectation is a two-way deal. If your franchise is not going to be consistent, how can you as a rookie be expected to be consistent? The Pistons didn't live up to their end of the bargain either. But with that in mind, I think the fact that his jumper is pretty far from a disaster, which was a little bit of a concern for him coming into the NBA, and the fact that he has displayed clear playmaking upside and insanely encouraging upside as a slasher specifically, I don't love his fit with Cade Cunningham, but in terms of just Jaden Ivey being a good NBA player, I feel very confident that that's going to happen. And whoever theoretically ends up getting Jaden, if he doesn't end up just breaking out with the Pistons to a degree where they can't move him, it could end up being a steal of a trade, like an all-time steal of a trade possibly. But if his jump shot looks legit as it has in the preseason, he is already a fantastic slasher, already a good passer, so there is a lot of upside with Jaden Ivey. For the Indiana Pacers, I'm going to go with Obi Toppin, who is a player who I think consistently gets disregarded because, admittingly, he can be a bit of a traffic cone, not a good defensive player whatsoever, and that is absolutely true. However, the role that he fills offensively, he really couldn't do it much better. Like, as a through and through play finisher, he's a great lob target and fast break target in general, good backdoor cutter, and then his three ball is like really reliable when that's an area that we weren't sure if that was going to really be all that good for his game. So when he was drafted, it was like, well, is this guy just a rim roller who can't shoot or play defense? But no, he's a rim roller who can't play defense, but he can shoot. So it would be great if his defense would improve to the point where he can end up being a really prolific and good player. But he is, at the bare minimum, very good on one end of the floor, and I feel like that often gets discounted just because of his defensive weaknesses, which I understand why that gets brought up a lot, but I feel like, I don't know, there are other players that it seemingly isn't brought up a lot because people recognize their offensive capability, and it seems like that is not always the most consistent through line of criticism. With the Milwaukee Bucks, I am going to go with Chris Middleton because I am happy to tell anybody who will listen that Chris Middleton really is just not the hospital patient that a lot of people seem to have the perception that he is. He's been fairly healthy and consistent his last couple of years. 2 years ago, I would understand if you would look at his 14, 15 points and go, that's a little low. But this previous year with Damian Lillard being there, it made a lot more sense. His efficiency was still fantastic. And when it came to the postseason, he was a 25-point per game scorer versus the Indiana Pacers on good efficiency. Like, I'm very confident that Chris Middleton is still mostly the Chris Middleton of old. He's just chilling. He's not really going for some crazy high box score because he never has. Sure, maybe it's a little bit harder for him to just casually cross that 20-point per game mark than it used to be, but the fact that he still has the capability of doing it and the capability of doing it over the most important stretch of basketball you can find, which is a playoff series, that is a very encouraging sign to me, and I don't think a lot of people are viewing the Milwaukee Bucks as essentially a big three when they more or less are that. For the Philadelphia 76ers, there was not an easy pick to make here. I decided to go with KJ Martin. Don't really have a great pick here because I think KJ is probably one of the only non-rotational pieces on this team that actually is kind of deserving of being a rotational piece. And then everybody else who is a rotational piece is either a star player like Maxey, Embiid, or Paul George, or it's like Kelly Oubre and Kyle Lowry, who are fine players, but I'm not going to outright say that they're underrated. But KJ Martin is a very good rim roller, a pretty damn good defensive player. Unfortunately, the jump shot is an area of concern, and that is where he does lack. I don't think it's bad enough to the point, though, that he is an outright lost cause. It might just be bad enough that the Sixers really don't have time to fuck around and see if he can figure out shooting. But if he could just shoot decently from three on low volume, on corner catch and shoots, and then do everything else that he does really well at an NBA level, he could be a very effective role player. For the New York Knicks, I am going with Mikal Bridges. The way that people were hating on Mikal after this Knicks trade, I didn't get it, man. A lot of people were like, they didn't really get all that much better. They gave up way too many assets to make this. I don't think people recognize how good Mikal was when he wasn't a top 2 option on his team. As good of a wing who isn't a prominent scoring option as you can get. Like a efficient 15, decent volume, 40% three-point shooting, second in defensive player of the year voting, granted one of the worst DPOY races in the history of this sport, but hey, Still, that level of impact as a defensive wing, like when he is locked in on the defensive end of the floor with the rest of this Knicks squad that's already so good at defense, dude, it's going to be devastating. I feel bad for pretty much any perimeter player that's going to have to match up against the Knicks, especially one that has to play them in a playoff series. Because even if Mikal sits, you're going to have to deal with OG. Even if both of them are sitting, you'll probably have to deal with Josh Hart. So yeah, I think Mikal stepping outside of the role that he was meant to play moved people too negative on his perception to what he actually is when he is in that most proper role. For the Toronto Raptors, I'm going to go with Immanuel Quickley. This is another case where I'm like, if you're a Raptors fan, you fucking know about Immanuel Quickley, but if you're not, you probably don't know all too well about the fact that in the last 38 games with Toronto, after being traded there for OG Anunoby along with RJ Barrett, he averaged 18 points and 7 assists per game, shot just short of 40% from 3 on very high volume, like 7+ attempts per game, and many of them off of the dribble 3-pointers. He's a pretty good creator offensively. I don't think he's like some phenomenal scorer or passer or anything like that, but he's very good at it. And then on the defensive end of the floor, he is a monster defensively, like all defense tiered level of defense. So to be able to be potentially a 20-8 guy on good efficiency on top of all of that, that is a very, very good player that the Toronto Raptors have, and he is someone who I'm going to be watching out for quite a bit. The Raptors in general are a team that I feel could go in a pretty dramatic, could have a pretty dramatic swing in either direction. Like, a lot of it is based on how well RJ Barrett's three-point shooting and Scotty Barnes' three-point shooting ends up holding up. But they have a lot of talent. They are not an untalented roster, to be sure, and Immanuel Quickley is definitely a little slept on. For the Brooklyn Nets, I am going to go with Cameron Johnson. I can't believe nobody has traded for this guy at this point. I do understand that there is a little bit of injury concerns, but they're not to a degree that it's like, oh, you're trading for a guy who's just going to be sitting on your bench all the time. Like, he's still consistently playing 50+ games. He's still consistently available when the playoffs come around. So on that end, I don't really think it's that big of an issue, and if anything, you can use that as a way of getting a discount price on otherwise a super impactful player. He is a really big forward who, you know, doesn't not use his size. He's not necessarily like, oh, he's some huge body and constantly using that on the defensive end of the floor, you know, as a slasher or anything like that, but he has size, and that's good, and it gives him defensive versatility. And then on top of that, he's one of the better high percentage, high volume catch and shoot guys in the entire league. I really don't understand what's not to love about him, and like, I'm very confident someone like OKC is gonna trade like 2 of their million first-round picks for him, and then it's just gonna be fucking unfair. Like, truly, if you're a contender and you can afford Cam Johnson, you should be trading for Cam Johnson, and I don't understand how he is still a net, and I will especially be shocked if he is still a net after this deadline, unless there is some contractual thing that I am not aware of that involves him being unable to be traded. But if that's not the case, if you're a contender and you have the assets, what are you doing? For the Orlando Magic, I am going to go with Wendell Carter Jr. because Goga Bitadze was like good for a few weeks for the Magic, and then immediately people were like, yeah, I guess Orlando should probably trade Wendell. I don't know what that shit was about, but I'm glad I'm not hearing it anymore. I'm glad that he is not somewhere else. But that said, if a team did want to trade for him, I do think there are a lot of teams that could super benefit from his skill set. The main one that stands out to me specifically is the New Orleans Pelicans, just in the same line of thinking with the Cameron Johnson OKC thing. Like, the Pelicans have a lot of draft picks from the Anthony Davis trade, from the Drew Holiday trade. They still have a good amount of firsts that aren't even their own. So they could probably afford the asking price for Wendell Carter, who is a good defensive player and a good three-point shooter out of the center position, which is of course something that the Pelicans are in desperate need of. Apparently they're going to be starting fucking Herb Jones at center, so maybe, I don't know, trade some draft picks for a super undervalued 3-and-D5. On to the Cleveland Cavaliers, I am going to go with Dean Wade, who I think is one of the most underrated 3-and-D players in the entire NBA. pretty much the same thought process as with Cam Johnson. He's a big forward who has high percentage and, at least in his case, decent volume three-point shooting. So what's not to love? He is pretty consistently one of the better members of, you know, in some of Cleveland's best lineups last year. He's pretty consistently in those lineups. Good shooter, good defender, good versatility. He's like 6'9", 6'10", can play the 3 and the 4. Like, dude's just good as hell, and he's really cheap. And you would see like, yeah, he averages like 5-6 points per game, so he can't be that good. Nah, man, in terms of doing the role player shit, Dean Wade is fantastic at that. Whether he stays in Cleveland or somebody else trades for him as well, I'm telling you, he would shock a lot of people. For the Los Angeles Lakers, I went with Rui. I wrote this list a while ago. I don't know if I feel that way because I don't know. I could see him averaging 20 in the right environment, but that's also not as though the Lakers haven't provided a fair enough environment to create that opportunity. He just hasn't really taken it. I don't know. I feel like LA could use him more in the offense. I also feel like Austin Reeves is underrated by non-Lakers fans and overrated by Lakers fans, which is a weird paradoxical situation. But I don't know. I don't really have a strong answer to that one, I suppose. For the Los Angeles Clippers, I am going with Chris Dunn, who is one of the best guard defenders in the NBA, bar none. He's a surprisingly solid creator both for himself and his teammates out of the pick and roll, and his three ball has finally resembled something fairly respectable, which is all that was really necessary for him to be a rather good player. For the Houston Rockets, I'm going with Jabari Smith Jr. Jabari is a really cool player with a lot of two-way upside. I feel like I rarely see his name mentioned when the Rockets are being discussed, despite the fact that he should very clearly be a very prominent part of their future. Even if he just ends up being like a super high value role player, he is the archetype of role player that like every NBA team super wants. That big forward who can stretch the floor, do a little bit of one-on-one scoring and attacking off of the catch. Like, this is the archetype of player that everybody wants. And to me, it seems like a lot of people treat him like he's just kind of there. And I don't know, he kind of always catches my eye when I watch him. And he might cap out at just a role player, but he also has some creating ability, good amount of face-up mid-range game to him. I'm curious to see where he develops, and he's probably my favorite player on the entire Houston Rockets roster, and the one I am most excited for. Most people would rather talk about Amen Thompson and Jalen Green, which I get, but Jabari Smith Jr., man, I don't know, I just really love a versatile four. For the San Antonio Spurs, gotta go with Devin Vassell. This is another case where Spurs fans know Devin well enough, but I don't really know how much the larger rest of the NBA fandom does. And it's a shame because he is one of the most fun shooters to watch in the NBA. Movement, catch and shoot guy, mid-range ability. Unfortunately, his off-the-dribble three-ball game has always been a little disappointing, but one of the better shooters in the NBA, no doubt, and should be a very good secondary scoring option alongside Victor Wembanyama, probably for a very long, prolonged stretch. For the Sacramento Kings, I'm going with Keon Ellis, an insanely good defender, ridiculous stats as a starter, steals and threes galore. He brought a new dynamic to Sacramento's rotation last year that was super interesting and allowed them to be a more defensive-minded team. He's one of the better point-of-attack defenders in the entire NBA, and it seemed like he kind of came out of nowhere for them. He's probably starting. I believe he should be a starter for them this next year, and man, just when you compare that to like Kevin Huerter before, like Kevin Huerter was a good three-point shooter, but he really didn't have the versatility that Keon brings to the table. Definitely didn't have the defense that he brings to the table. And I think the Sacramento Kings are just a more well-balanced lineup with that situation. For the Golden State Warriors, I'm going with Moses Moody. Surely Steve does not have any more excuse to not play him 25 plus minutes a night, but I don't know, maybe he'll figure out a way to do it. It is plausible. For the Portland Trailblazers, I am going with Anthony Simons, who is one of the best off-the-dribble three-point shooters in the entire NBA. Three-point shooters, period, but like in terms of the like Stephen Curry, Damian Lillard type three-pointers, he is up there with some of the best. Arguably, maybe even he is the third best after those two players at pull-up three-point shooting. More of a secondary creator, just because his playmaking is not all that great, but I do think he can be primed to be deadly in the right context. For the Minnesota Timberwolves, I have to go with Rudy Gobert. I apologize. I know everyone's sad. Everyone's mad at me that I'm saying Rudy Gobert is underrated, but the way that the people talk about him is so consistently crazy and out of this world incorrect that I just can't help but to call him underrated. I really don't know what else to do. Like, that's on y'all for making this stupid fucking discourse as prominent as it is. For the Memphis Grizzlies, I'm going with GG Jackson. He struggled with efficiency a little bit with his rookie campaign as a 19-year-old, but he is on a garbage team, and the dude is primed to cook in Memphis, I think, because the offense featuring as many weapons as it will with everybody healthy, it's going to draw the defense's attention away from GG, and he's going to get a lot easier looks than he did in his rookie year, and given that he still managed to be a decent volume, decent efficiency scorer at the age of 19 on a terrible team, tells me that his offense, when that lineup is healthy, is probably going to be devastatingly efficient and effective. So he is a rather large piece in this Memphis Grizzlies core that I think is left out of the conversation quite often by people who are not Grizzlies fans. But I digress. Moving on to the New Orleans Pelicans, Herb Jones is the best non-big defender in the league, although apparently he's going to be a big now. Apparently he's going to be playing the 5, which is very interesting because I can see a world with him and Zion being good enough at the big man stuff, despite both of them being like 6'5", 6'6". However, I don't think that's going to work. I probably wouldn't bet on it working, but Herb is a good shot blocker. Him and Zion are good rebounders, so it could theoretically work, and I'm interested to see it. Now, how good his defense is was pretty well understood going into the NBA that was going to be the case. He was like, I don't know what the college DPOY is, but I believe he won that award for Alabama. All of that being the case, there was a lot of question of, well, what is his offensive game going to look like? Right out of the gate, his jump shot was not as discouraging as it seemed like it might be, and then in this previous season, he turned into a 42% three-point shooter on respectable volume. I don't know necessarily how well that will hold up to a prolonged, higher volume three-point shooting career, but I do know that it's a very, very encouraging sign that he could develop his three at this speed, because typically speaking, that doesn't fucking happen. For the OKC Thunder, Aaron Wiggins, speaking of extremely efficient three-point shooting, he was hilariously efficient from basically every spot on the floor last season. Very solid defender and a really big body. 49% from three, okay? Not the highest volume, but clearly an indicator that he is ready for more volume, because if you can shoot that high on 3 attempts per game, who's to say you can't shoot 38% on 7-8 attempts per game? I certainly think that's very well possible while being a big forward, while being a solid defender, while being a good slasher and someone who can attack off of the catch. I genuinely think OKC might have a diamond in the rough here, which is fucking obnoxious, because how many diamonds in the rough is one franchise allowed to have? I think they should be looking at him as potentially their long-term starting 3 rather than Lou Dort, but we will see. For the Phoenix Suns, Royce O'Neal is a solid 3-and-D player that gets, you get him for an insanely reasonable price. In terms of like contractual value, I think he's one of the more valued guys in the league. Not someone you can really complain about. And, well, I guess that's about as high of praise as you can really give most of Phoenix's role players. But hey, super cheap, super effective, super non-disruptive type of player any NBA team would want. For the Denver Nuggets, I will go with Julian Strawther. Weird rookie season with inconsistent minutes last year, but he displayed a legit ability to create off of the dribble. If those shots hit a little bit more consistently, Julian could be the saving grace for a Nuggets bench that desperately needs him. They are in a very short supply of rotational NBA players, so he could be that for them. For the Utah Jazz, Colin Sexton has been someone who's been on my shit list for many, many years. In fact, he's probably been on my most overrated list a good handful of times. However, he has corrected a lot of my issues with him. He's increased his three-point attempt rate by 7% as of last year. He's improved drastically as a playmaker, and he's in a more reduced role. So you know, my issue with him in the past was I don't like guards who are small, dribble the ball a lot, but are neither strong playmakers nor strong three-point shooters. But he has managed to become both of those things while reducing the amount of time he has the ball in his hands. So he has dramatically increased his effectiveness and efficiency and actual ability as an NBA player, rather than just simply putting up 25 points but on not the best efficiency and not while being all that impactful. So ironically, it's weird that he's doing this in Utah of all places, because this is the place where it makes sense to just be a shot chucker, because who else is going to shoot the ball? But no, he's adapted his game to fit the NBA significantly better than the first couple of years of his career, where he admittingly put up good numbers, but there was a reason that Cleveland really did not have any interest in giving him anything resembling the max money that he was looking for. For the Dallas Mavericks, last team on this list, I'm going to go with Klay Thompson. This is another one like Mikal, where in my opinion, the reaction to them and their change of scenery over the offseason was just overblown as fuck. Like, the amount of people who called Klay to Dallas a bad or mid move was baffling to me, especially for the fact you were getting him at the cheap price of $16 million a year, which in the modern NBA is nothing. Like, $16 million a year is like the 4th or 5th biggest contract on most NBA teams. Like, not a huge deal at all. I even saw some people saying like that he's not going to shoot threes well for them. Like, someone said on Twitter that he was going to shoot 32% from three. And I'm like, brother, one thing that Klay has always done well is shoot the three ball. Even these last few seasons where he's been disappointed, he at least shot the three ball well. He shot the ball too much, and I think a lot of the problem with him was that his role was overblown. Similar to Mikal, he was doing too much, so people got the perception of guy who does too much while not doing it well enough, when if you actually instead take that guy and say, hey, you do this job, this specific set of rules, and you work really well within those confines, I think Klay Thompson will be a super effective player for Dallas and will make them way harder to guard. In my bold predictions for the 2025 season video, I said that Dallas would have the greatest offense of all time, and to me that's pretty much entirely predicated on now. Klay Thompson is your third option, and that's a hell of a good third option, even if he's not as good as he used to be. That's it. That is the most underrated player on every NBA team, in my opinion. Let me know what you think, maybe who your most underrated players on every team are. Again, go check out that Patreon if you want to join our discourse to have some private chats with me and Rudy and other like-minded, also Rusty Bucket subscribers. But with that said, shout out to Nick for editing this video, and goodbye.